Welcome back to our final panel of the afternoon here at the Conference on White Christian Nationalism and the Midterm Elections. And in this panel, we'll be discussing authoritarianism. Why is Christian nationalism taking an authoritarian turn, and just how authoritarian is it? And our panelists will be Ruth Braunstein, Annika Brockschmidt, Anthea Butler, and Jeff Sharlet. And I'm turning it over to Ruth to open up. To Annika to open up.
I've really enjoyed is maybe the wrong word, but I found the day very interesting so far. And as Phil said, our topic today is authoritarianism and white Christian nationalism and how the two are connected. So you've already heard about the ideology and the organization of white Christian nationalism and its proponents. So I was thinking that I'm going to say a few words on the nature of authoritarianism and then give you an example of how the two are connected. So authoritarianism is all about order. It appeals to those who express a desire for established hierarchies and for the status quo, and who also, and this is important, express a fear of perceived outsiders. And these outsiders are basically any, or can be any marginalized group that can be made both scapegoat and existential threat. So authoritarian leaders and parties promise to preserve a certain existing social hierarchy and established order. And their promise is as simple as it is effective: to protect their followers from changes that they perceive as threats, and that they are willing to use violence and the power of the state, if they have it, to achieve their goals. So followers of authoritarians perceive threats to the status quo as existential threats to themselves. That's why this is so potent, because it's a very emotionally heightened feeling that this evokes. Now, what does that mean? Those perceived threats can be anything that challenges the desired order. So anything from social justice movements to changing or evolving social norms, to demographic change or increasing diversity. These developments in the world around them are seen as existential threats that need to be squashed. And the fear of the other is very central to authoritarianism. And this other, and I think that's important to understand sort of the strategy of the right in this instance, is interchangeable. It can be any marginalized group or movement. And this explains why the right shifts so effortlessly from one moral panic to the other, be it critical race theory, imaginary caravans, or LGBTQ people. And this is the example that I want to give you. In the past months alone, we have seen an unprecedented attack on the rights of LGBTQ people, and especially trans people, in Republican-controlled state legislatures. They are a page out of the authoritarian playbook, with the authoritarian party using, in this case, the state legislature, to implement discriminatory policies to further suppress and single out, for further attacks, those who the movement uses as a scapegoat, those who don't conform, or in this case, whose very existence undermines or threatens the basis of their ideology. So most authoritarians subscribe to a sort of militant form of masculinity that also means strictly binary gender roles, which they often see as God-given and therefore unchangeable. In white Christian nationalism, a more fluid understanding of gender roles is akin to an affront against nature and against God himself. Now, all of this is not new, ideologically speaking. We already mentioned the crusade against LGBTQ rights, back in the days of Anita Bryant today. However, the harshness of these anti-LGBTQ laws that we're seeing these days show a new escalation in anti-democratic radicalization. And their numbers are staggering. So the annual number of anti-LGBTQ bills that have been filed have skyrocketed from 41 in 2018 to 238 just from January to March 2022. That was just 3 months. So that means that this year has already broken the record in the number of anti-LGBTQ laws that have been filed. And it's no coincidence that as of May 2022, a total of 22 states had not only enacted anti-trans laws, but also anti-abortion laws. Both categories curtail bodily autonomy. And the targets of what we refer to as white Christian nationalists have changed over the years. We have witnessed now this shift towards restricting trans rights. And the focus on trans issues has emerged over the past couple of years. When you look at the Texas GOP's party platform from 2014, the word trans does not appear. When you look at today's party platform, there are large sections dedicated to curtailing trans rights. So why now? Why focus on trans issues now? I would say with the support of same-sex marriage at a constant high and an unprecedented high, the religious and political right have moved away from openly attacking gay rights, even though they haven't changed their stance on this issue. They have just realized that it's ineffective as a mobilization tool at the moment. And they have moved on to an even smaller, more marginalized group, trans people. They present an easier target, there's a smaller group, and the public is largely uneducated when it comes to trans rights and trans issues in general. But their existence, and this is where the ideological part comes in, the very existence of trans people is an affront to the religious right. They see them as basically the most extreme version of what they see as a permissive, decadent, sexually perverted, secular society that has fallen away from God, from order, and from fixed gender roles. And the gender binary forms the basis of much of the ideology in white Christian nationalism, the idea of a heteronormative patriarchal order, which is represented, as we've already heard, by the nuclear family, with the father as the head of the household. And then you have the same model in the public with the strongman leader at the top of the movement, who protects the nation against all threats, foreign and especially domestic. And while some right-wingers tried to use so-called bathroom bills in the past, those weren't really popular, weren't that successful. And now they have done what they always do when they realize that one narrative doesn't further their political goal, because they're very pragmatic. They abandon the narrative that didn't work and chose a new one. And the goal, to be clear, is to establish or hold on to, depending on, the spin, hold on to basically white Christian hegemony, where mainly white Christian cis men have the political but also the cultural power within a patriarchal framework. So they adapted to the situation and changed their narrative. Now they claim this is in part about fairness, but it's really all about the children. And that, to an audience that's largely uninformed on trans issues, can be very persuasive, because when you have no further knowledge of it, it sounds reasonable. We have to protect the kids. And trans issues are complex, and they can't be reduced to a soundbite. And this presents an, I think, very dangerous opportunity for right-wingers to secure allies via this anti-trans campaign in a more politically moderate or even in leftist parts of society. It creates a pipeline, a potential pipeline for right-wing radicalization via the reductionist framework of gender essentialism. And on top of that, social media exacerbates this dynamic. It's been shown that consuming anti-trans content on TikTok eventually leads the user down right-wing rabbit holes. So what about the children? Why do they have to be saved? Well, the right wing claims that children must be saved from doctors who administer life-saving gender-affirming care and who are described by commentators on the right in the vilest terms. There's comparisons to Nazi doctors. They describe them as butchers who mutilate children. And this playbook against trans people isn't new. It relies on the same narratives that the Christian right has used in the past to stir up hate against gay people. It basically relies on the narrative of social contagion. So the faulty logic goes, because trans people or gay people can't reproduce, they have to, and again, I'm speaking in quotes, these are not my words, that's why they have to indoctrinate children into their perverse ideology. And this is how transness or gayness spreads. So this is highly effective because firstly, it demonizes the group that is being othered, but it also lets the accuser stand in the best possible light because they're concerned, they want to protect the kids. And this is an old tactic of the right wing. And I'll give you another example from Germany. Yes, current day Germany. A couple of years ago, the NPD, which is the German neo-Nazi party, founded Facebook groups against pedophilia, those were the names, where they asked for the death penalty for child molesters and were quickly joined by hundreds and hundreds of thousands who liked an event called, quote, "Children are the future against child molestation," end quote. People who these neo-Nazis normally would not reach. The same tactic is now being employed to hurt trans people by casting them as pedophiles or predators, as groomers, and those who support LGBTQ rights as enablers. And this strategy is very dangerous, and this is not just my take on it, but we can see it play out live as we speak. And this is because, you know, most people are fine with horrible things happening to people who abuse kids. And I've written an article on this topic together with Thomas Lecaque. And in the article, we note that QAnon uses a very similar narrative framework, where save the children is all too often understood as murder our opponents. So that means that medical staff who administer abortions or gender-affirming care are in danger. I'm sure you've heard about Boston Children's Hospital that has received 2 bomb threats, but there's also other clinics and medical staff that are under attack. And this is not surprising with the narratives that are being peddled. If you really believe that children are being mutilated, that they're being indoctrinated, that they're being abused, then why not resort to violence if nobody else is doing anything? And this shows a similar mechanism like anti-abortion violence, which also shows to have risen in the past couple of years, and especially after the Dobbs ruling. Like the first numbers have been out, the numbers have gone up. And violence against LGBTQ and especially trans people and the institutions that care for them are also on the rise. 2021 was the deadliest year for trans people in the US since the Human Rights Campaign Foundation started tracking them in 2013. At least, and again, this is at least, 47 trans people were killed in 2021. And lies of an almighty secret trans lobby in the shadows, indoctrinating children, are being told by the same politicians who are too happy to drop the name George Soros. Again, this is not a coincidence. Both fascists and authoritarians in general have long used the image of a marginalized group in the shadows, manipulating governments, and this is what we're seeing here. It's right out of their playbook. So the enemy is both morally corrupt, but also repulsive, reprehensible, and perverted, so that people are disgusted by them, but they're also incensed enough to be enraged, to not have this, so that they're not a laughing stock, because authoritarians need a group that provides an existential threat to the fog, basically, in this narrative. And I like to quote Jason Stanley, who's sitting here today on this. And he's explained in the past, quote, "The logic of fascism is great replacement theory, the fear that a dominant group will be culturally or physically replaced by a scapegoated minority group. The attack on trans women employs this logic, raising fear that women as a class will be replaced," end quote. And I'm closing up now, don't worry. So it's not a coincidence then that authoritarian regimes implement anti-LGBTQ laws to solidify their power, be it cultural or political, as evidenced, for example, by Russia and Hungary. And those are the countries that the American right looks to. They're models of authoritarian control enforced by the state. Putin gave a speech today where he railed against sex change operations, in quotes. Italy just elected their first fascist leader since World War II, which is also an incredible sentence to say. And in her speeches, Giorgia Meloni rails against LGBTQ people, claims the family and women are in danger of being replaced. Make no mistake, this is the playbook that Republican legislatures are following when they implement anti-LGBTQ laws.
Thank you very much, Annika. Our next speaker is Ruth Braunstein from the University of Connecticut.
Great, and thanks so much for laying that out. It might seem like I'm going a bit far afield, but I think we'll see there's some through lines here. So as the midterm election approaches, and I think we're not very far out at this point, Republican Party leaders and advisors have begun raising the alarm about what might seem like a minor provision of the Inflation Reduction Act that would invest $80 billion in the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS. And this money is intended to modernize outdated technology and increase enforcement of tax laws. Citing this investment, Senator Ted Cruz has repeatedly warned of a coming shadow army of 87,000 IRS agents. This fear-mongering was so successful that the Republican Party as a whole embraced it as a key talking point in recent weeks and months. Just last week, when GOP leader Kevin McCarthy rolled out his commitment to America, he announced the party's first order of business if they regained control of Congress. Quote, "On our very first bill, we're going to repeal 87,000 IRS agents." Now, the preference to pay lower taxes is as American as apple pie, and it's been a centerpiece of modern republicanism. But demonizing the IRS has not. In fact, mainstream Republicans have historically maintained a commitment to cutting taxes without promoting hysterical fears about the enforcers of tax laws. We can think about it like this. When champions of tax cuts have talked about starving the beast, they generally recognize that the beast is big government. The IRS is just the messenger. Republican President George W. Bush was a huge fan of tax cuts, but he nonetheless requested an increase in funding for the IRS, insisting that, quote, "Americans who play by the rules and pay their taxes deserve confidence that others pay their fair share as well. And also, that enforcement more than pays for itself." This made complete sense for the leader of a party that prided itself on its commitment to law and order on one hand and balanced budgets on the other. For his father, George H.W. Bush, these commitments also required vocally rejecting anti-government rhetoric. In 1995, the former president publicly resigned as a life member of the National Rifle Association when the NRA's Wayne LaPierre stood by his characterization of federal agents as, quote, jackbooted thugs who sought to attack law-abiding citizens, even after anti-government extremists carried out a deadly attack on a federal building in Oklahoma City. Today, the Republican Party looks very different. Emboldened by years of a sitting president denouncing the deep state, the party has embraced this precise brand of anti-government rhetoric, and their latest target is the IRS. In addition to Cruz's talk of a shadow army, Senator Rick Scott issued an open letter to American job seekers, discouraging them from applying for the new positions at the IRS super police force. The Republican candidate for governor of Arizona has promoted the conspiracy theory that the new IRS funding is connected to the FBI's search of former President Donald Trump's home, warning, quote, "Not a single one of us is safe." And Congressman Jim Banks tweeted shortly after the Mar-a-Lago raid, quote, if the FBI can raid the home of a former US president, imagine what 87,000 more IRS agents will do to you." Unless you believe these messages are confined to the fringe of the party, the Republican National Committee itself released an ominous ad focused on, quote, "growing fears about a growing IRS." And then just last week, there was McCarthy and his colleagues' focus on repealing 87,000 IRS agents during their rollout of the Republican commitment to America. So what? How do we make sense of this recent uptick in anti-IRS sentiment? And how does it connect to the topic we're here to discuss today? First, I think it's important to situate Republicans' concerns about the IRS within the context of the rest of their current platform, and particularly where law enforcement is concerned. In a video introducing the commitment to America, images of police officers and border agents flashed on the screen as McCarthy spoke of his party's commitment to, quote, "a nation that's safe, where communities are protected by the police and criminals are prosecuted." Well, what about tax criminals? A properly funded IRS would have the ability to enforce tax law. Specifically, the new funding for IRS enforcement will, according to the Treasury Department, be used to, quote, "go after wealthy tax cheats who are disproportionately responsible for hundreds of millions of unpaid taxes every year." The White House has promised audits will not increase for households earning less than $400,000 per year, but even so, since the bill was passed, Republicans have repeated the false claim that the funds will be used to target middle-class families and small businesses. They are saying, basically out loud, that these Americans should not be held accountable for breaking tax laws. In contrast, Republicans have been comfortable with the fact that low-income recipients of the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC, have for years been audited at much higher rates than other groups, with the highest audit rates found in counties that are poor, rural, mostly African-American, and in the South, according to a recent analysis by ProPublica. Meanwhile, at the same event where McCarthy announced his intention to repeal 87,000 IRS agents, his colleague, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, announced another top priority: the hiring of 200,000 more police officers around the country to make sure that our communities are safe. Congressman Steve Scalise tied the concerns about the IRS and law enforcement together explicitly. Describing how Democrats threaten the American dream, he cited new taxes, 87,000 IRS agents. You know, all of my years in Congress, I have never had a single phone call from anybody saying, "Steve, please add more people to the IRS." This was a predictable applause line. If there's 87,000 people needed in America, it's at the border to secure America's border, not over at the IRS to go after small businesses and hardworking families. They also took aim at efforts to, quote, defund the police, using this phrase twice during the same event. And yet, in the next breath, they promised to defund the agency responsible for enforcing tax laws. In their new book, The Flag and the Cross, Phil Gorski and Sam Perry offer a way of resolving this apparent discrepancy in Republicans' approach to law enforcement today. The logic is simple: freedom for us, authoritarian social control for them. We see this double standard play out in differential levels of concern about who gets audited by the IRS. Audits are bad for the white-coated categories of the middle class and small businesses, but necessary for Black-coded EITC recipients. And we see this play out in differential levels of concern about different forms of law enforcement. Many Republicans balk at calls to hold accountable police officers who have killed Black citizens, instead promising even more police funding to, quote, keep our communities safe. And yet, unfounded concerns that some white middle-class Americans may be essentially asked for extra paperwork has led Republicans to paint the IRS as a violent and existential threat to American freedom. But whose freedom? Freedom for us, order for them. The second way we can make sense of Republicans' anti-IRS rhetoric is to situate it within a longer history that reveals the extremist roots of these attacks. Anti-IRS fear-mongering did not come out of nowhere. Conspiracy theories about the IRS have long festered at the extremist edges of the American right. The question is how they moved to the political mainstream. Media coverage of Republicans' recent attacks on the IRS have focused on a pivotal moment in the recent past: conservative backlash to the IRS's improper targeting of Tea Party groups who were seeking tax-exempt status during the Obama administration. Responding to these revelations at the time, the founder of the Tea Party Patriots attacked the IRS as, quote, trained thugs and gangsters who, quote, have declared war on the American people. Movement leaders and their allies in Congress swiftly called for the IRS to be investigated and moved to cut the agency's funding. Again, they didn't come up with this out of nowhere. They were drawing from a playbook Republicans had used before. In 1997 and 98, congressional Republicans led a major effort to rein in the IRS that ultimately won bipartisan support for reforms that significantly curtailed the agency's enforcement power. Theatrical hearings featured witnesses who, according to one source, testified behind black curtains with their voices disguised like mafia snitches to protect their identity. And according to another, focused on supposed commando-style raids by armed tax inspectors wearing flak jackets, one step short of jackboots. According Congressman Dick Armey, who we might recall went on to lead FreedomWorks, a major Tea Party organization, described Republicans' hope for the process. He said, the IRS is too big and too mean, but once this bill becomes law, the IRS will just be too big. And, you know, Republicans have been chipping away at the size of the IRS really ever since. These efforts were notable not only because they were successful, and despite the fact that much of the IRS's alleged misconduct was later debunked, but also because they marked a key moment when the Republican Party gave a national platform to arguments previously heard primarily within anti-government extremist circles. As Daniel Levitas, an expert on the American far right, wrote in a 2001 report to the Southern Poverty Law Center, lawmakers chose to emphasize the image of a menacing federal agency out of control, an image long cultivated by the patriarchs of tax protest and other ideologues of the radical right. And in so doing, they legitimized those concerns. Now, this isn't the first time that Republicans have given a platform to these kinds of arguments, and I can talk more about several events earlier in the 90s when they did that. But for now, I'll close by just introducing you to one of those patriarchs of the tax protest movement. Gordon Kahl is perhaps best known because of how he died in 1983 in a violent confrontation with federal agents. His death elevated him to the status of a martyr within the tax protest and anti-government worlds. But it's his life that bears scrutiny for our purposes. Kahl was a self-proclaimed Christian patriot and member of the far-right Posse Comitatus. After embracing the white supremacist and anti-Semitic ideology of Christian identity, he came to believe that taxation was a scheme by international Jews to enslave America. And he stopped paying his taxes, similar to the kinds of dark, shadowy networks who are controlling America we just heard about. In 1983, Kahl shot and killed two federal marshals when they attempted to arrest him on a tax-related charge. After escaping and going into hiding, he defended himself in a 16-page letter, writing, quote, "We are a conquered and occupied nation, conquered and occupied by the Jews, and there are hundreds or maybe thousands of front organizations doing their ungodly work." Front organizations like the IRS. He wrote that he did not regret using violence. He believed it was necessary in order to defend, quote, Christianity and the white race. Kahl's concerns live on in current promoters of tax protest, though the movement has evolved over time in much the same way that creationism morphed into the more legitimate sounding intelligent design. The most prominent peddler of tax protest today is an amateur tax expert named Pete Hendrickson, who teaches taxpayers the, quote, liberating truth about the income tax. Through his seminars and book, Cracking the Code, he encourages them to be the storm, a phrase he's been using since long before it became associated with QAnon. He teaches true American patriots that by filing educated tax returns, claiming no income, they will not only be able to keep their hard-earned money, but also help restore Western civilization and American freedom. Though his weapon of choice today is mainly fraudulent paperwork, in 1990, when he was 34 years old, he mailed a package to the tax thieves at the IRS with a return address reading "Freedom-loving Americans." Inside was a bomb. Today, as elected officials sow fears of a shadow army of IRS agents, it's important to recall this shadow history. Those who verbally attack the IRS today do not necessarily share these men's propensity to violence or their white Christian supremacist views. But when they repeat barely sanitized versions of their alarmist rhetoric, they are knowingly or not continuing their violent anti-government project. And they're introducing and legitimizing these sentiments for new generations of conservatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Next speaker is Jeff Sharlet of Dartmouth.
Thanks for those two great talks. When I try to address this question in my own head of our panel is framed around the sort of authoritarianism within Christian nationalism and how it became authoritarian. One of the things that I'm always going to as I'm trying to write about these topics is to look at the sort of the passage of metaphors into real life, the concretization of metaphor, such that spiritual war perhaps becomes combat. So I'm grateful to you, Ruth, for giving us that example of violence, of this isn't just talk, it's not just a story, it becomes real, it becomes a bomb in the mail. And Annika, thinking of your paper, I just couldn't help but think about the question of order, and that to the fascist, to the authoritarian, a trans woman or a trans man is the incarnation of the decadent state. The bodily, to them, it's, oh, look, this metaphor that I was afraid of made real, and that person standing over there. I thought about this too, because I was going to start my talk with projecting from some research I've been doing, going around. I'm not going around talking to people with guns. It's just that everybody has guns, and I talk to them. And a militia leader in Wisconsin showing off some of his AR-15s. And then it occurred to me, no, wait a minute. You know, not everyone thinks this is a good way to spend their summers. They don't see those guns all the time, and projected it could be ugly, and who knows who's watching out there. I didn't want to startle them, although it occurs to me that the fact that I even have that pause, that we think seeing a gun might be frightening, when, of course, there are, what, 400 million guns in civilian hands in the United States, shows us just how far we are behind the curve of the concretization of the metaphor, the proliferation of AR-15s. And I think part of the reason that is, and when I think about this turn toward authoritarianism, I think the authoritarianism has always been there, but it has pivoted. Partly we've had difficulty naming it, I would argue, because there's always been within Christian nationalism a tension between an avant-garde, a term we associate with the arts, but who some on the right actually use for themselves correctly in the Leninist sense, an avant-garde and a populist front, another term borrowed from the communist past. But the authoritarian turn now, why something different now I think is happening, is when many right-wing tendencies converge and amplify one another. So the elites and populists both, instead of sort of pulling away or striving for domination, are all moving in roughly the same direction. Although Eric asked earlier about fault lines, and I think that is the key question, because they are there. The NatCons and the integralists have had a falling out, I've just learned from the great journalist Catherine Joyce. Good news. But look, instead of not just these fault lines within, say, the elite intellectual organizations that are scholars and writers, maybe working with printed matter, we look at, but look at the intellectuals of the National Conservatives and the brawling Proud Boys, the rad trad Catholic intellectuals and the everyday white evangelicals, the Council for National Policy, as Ann Nelson writes about, and the would-be Gary Coopers of the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement, the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America organization, which did so much to topple Roe, and the blood libelists of QAnon. the post-liberal Notre Dame scholar Patrick Deneen, and the post-liberal martyr Ashley Babbitt, the Federalist Society, and all the countless unaffiliated dudes who will smoke you up in the weird sort of Grateful Dead tailgating vibe at Trump rallies. I don't know if people realize all those people are there in this same space. I used to look at this mainly through the lens of elites, particularly an organization called the Fellowship Foundation or the Family, the group that organized the National Prayer Breakfast. And there's been some resistance in the room to sort of looking at parallels to Germany in the 1930s. So I say, fine, look at America in the 1930s, when we had some very powerful people saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, I think democracy may have run its course. And I think communism, that's not for us. The Fellowship Foundation, who in its early days, actually, there's this amazing memo where they decide to stop using the Sieg Heil salute. Oh God, I just did that on video. Who are the real Nazis? Because it was, and they underlined it, too fascist. It's sort of Goldilocks fascism, just fascist enough. They were always authoritarian. They began with the idea of crushing organized labor. That was the project then. This is long before the integration of schools. This is long before Roe v. Wade. But there was a way in which their authoritarianism was removed. I remember Senator Sam Brownback, who was once, he was the Josh Hawley of his day, saying, I have one constituent and one constituent only, God. They resisted the incarnation. They resisted the personality cult. I can't help but draw a connection between their obsession with what they see as the incarnation and trans bodies and their acceptance of the incarnation of authority in Trump. The coming down to earth of the God King. He's here, right? So I used to think they would never do it. I even wrote a chapter once called The F Word, Fascism Will Never Come to America, because fundamentalism, for all its troubles, will never accept a worldly individual. I was wrong. How did they get there? Well, they're following Trump. And who is Trump following? As Bart noted, he uses the rallies like focus groups. And as Ann and Catherine noted, there are many focus groups out there. Every Christian nationalist church is a focus group, which is to say it's a call and response. And I so appreciate what Bradley was saying about the pastors following the pulpit. Sometimes there's a lot of static there. At other times, the transmission is clear. Right now, the transmission is clear both ways. And that's led me to turn from the elite side to the populist front. And I don't have to go digging for it like I did the Fellowship Foundation or Ann did with Council National Policy, because the populist front flies flags. The great proliferation of flags across the country. You've seen these, the Blue Lives Matter flag, which the creator told me, I mean, people debate, it's not about the creator says, yeah, I made it as a rebuttal to Black Lives Matter. So we can settle that question once and for all. The guy who made it said that's why he did it. The Yale Gadsden "Don't Tread on Me" flag, all the varieties of Trump flag, all the gun flags, the "Come and Take It" flags, the AR-15 flags, the Punisher skulls, so many bones and skeletons and skulls, the memento mori of the new authoritarianism, which says that we all must die, but some of us first, which is the increasingly popular all Black American flag, no mercy, no quarter, no surrender. It is an eliminationist flag, an exterminationist flag. It's a genocide flag. The idea that in the coming civil war, there will be no prisoners to be taken. We can only kill them all. I want to read a brief passage from a project I'm working on where I've been traveling. I wandering around talking to people about their flags. And this is in Wisconsin in the days after Roe fell, when Wisconsin, ostensibly blue state, reverted back to its 1849 law. Waukesha then, dense white flight suburb of Milwaukee, where last November, a man who called himself Math Boy Fly plowed through a Christmas parade, killing 6. Some of you may know, those of us who follow the right, this has become another martyrdom story for us because Math Boy Fly was Black and because he'd expressed support for Black Lives Matter, and because the victims were white, they decided it was a terrorist attack, of which there's no evidence it was, as awful as it was. in Waukesha, where in 2014, two 12-year-old girls took a third girl to the woods and stabbed her 19 times. They wanted to ingratiate themselves with an imaginary character they had found out about called Slender Man, an internet meme made real, the metaphor made real or real enough through the knives of children who believed what they read online. In Waukesha, as you come off the highway, where you would typically find a welcoming sign boasting of past championships, there's a hillside in which stand dozens of hand-painted billboards. Not enough attention has been paid by the art historians to the new American folk art of fascism, of which there's a great deal. These billboards ran against Joe Biden, says Mr. Beijing bite me, and before him, Obama, against local and state politicians, against tyranny and taxes and education. Creeping critical race theory warns the newest member of the local school board is intertwined, and it is soft, and it is subtle. A fresher sign declares Kovic with a K in bright red, bracketed by the jagged lightning bolts of the Nazi SS, is all the work of one man. His discontent is said to have begun some 2 decades ago when a road project threatened his property or failed to cross his property and raise its value. Which was it? Nobody I spoke to was certain. It didn't matter. Memes and grievances rise and fall according to the currents of sublimated mourning, eddying around this talking point or that. And I just want to put a word into the conversation that we haven't said yet. COVID, I can't help but think the new authoritarianism, the particular authoritarianism turn is accelerating after the death of millions. Displaced grief. Sometimes it's happening without sense, like a man up the hill who, when I asked about his Trump 24 flag, cursed the Democrats for outlawing abortion. And sometimes in open defiance of reason, Slender Man, Let's Go Brandon, the Christmas parade, and the Highland Park 4th of July mass murderer, Bobby Crimo, who once attended a Trump rally dressed as Waldo of Where's Waldo fame, and who may or may not have been truly aware of politics as such at all. His on life rippled with right-wing hatreds, but he dedicated the days before his crime to a sped-up aesthetic of images and ideologies crashing into one another that is sometimes called schizo-wave. It's a vile term, a grotesque romanticization of mental illness, an awful metaphor for the quickening of our fragmentation, the great acceleration, a simultaneous explosion and collapse of meaning. And I think part of that when I'm thinking what Annika says about order, the order at the moment is chaos. And I think of Lance Wallnau's The Chaos Canon, that there is an order to be found and sought in chaos. Like schizowave in its verb form, schizoposting. Accelerationism is a relatively recent term brought into wider contemporary use in 2010 by 2 Marxist political scientists via the influence of a 2-volume work of 1970s French theory, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which some of you probably know. Well, crisis gathers speed, force and speed, politics withers and retreats. The Marxist political scientists Accelerate Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics announced. And the overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind. It was rejection of the slow, small work of solidarity in favor of a future more modern. Yes, said fascist intellectuals, adapting the concept to its own end. Yes, let's leave democracy behind. The new fascists like the idea of hastening the end of a liberal order. And I think I've come to the end of my 10 minutes, so I'm going to sort of stop there. There's some more about what the fascists did with that concept, and I think it speaks also to that question of post-millennialism and the redoubt, the temptation to burn everything down. But I would just add this one paragraph of meaning exploding and collapsing. Predicting violence, the night Dobbs came down, Fox News pundit Monica Crowley described pro-choice America as a death cult. The left calls the right a death cult too. But for all its guns and Punisher skulls and actual killers, fascism is actually worse than a death cult. It's an innocence cult. The belief that one might be innocent of history, read race, as a fetus is of the world, perfect in pink, white, unbloody in the Dobbsian imagination of the womb. The gun, too, is made clean by the cult of innocence, born again, not as a tool of aggression, but of defense, as the protection of purity, save the children. Inscribed by a growing number of gun manufacturers, as Peter Manseau has noted in his research, a growing number of gun manufacturers with stars and stripes and biblical verses. The guns themselves advertise as a form of evangelism, a means of spreading God's goodness in the world, like a baby, the fetus and the gun. And I am waiting for the flag that puts them both on together. All right, I'll stop there.
All right, on to Anthea Butler from the University of Pennsylvania to close out this this lightning round.
Wow. I feel like there are skeletons or ghosts in the room. And one of the ghosts in the room, I think, is the ghost of race. Even though we've called this white Christian nationalism, we haven't talked much about race. And so I want to start off by talking about how I even got into this. And it wasn't when you thought, it was in graduate school. I picked up a book by Michael Barkin, and it was about, you know, the rise of people who were like in Stormfront and all these other groups and what effect they were having on the country. Now, as an African-American woman, I knew this as a historian because Black people have always had to think about lynching. We've always had to think about violence. We've always had to think about the specter of white people coming for us, right? And so now what is very interesting to me is that white people are finally catching up to their fear. They are catching up to the fear that, oh my God, this country is turning. It is becoming something else where I am not going to be the majority, I am going to be the minority. And so Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is something I should embrace because this might protect me. At the end of the day, my faith might protect me. It might keep me from all of these things that I have feared of the retribution about slavery, the retribution about Jim Crow, the retribution about Black bodies and Jewish bodies in rivers in Mississippi. And so now here we are having to deal with this thing that has actually been among us for a very long time. We just didn't want to deal with it that way. We called it other things. We've tried to figure out how to rationalize it, how to make it clean, how to make it think about, you know, it's somebody else's problem, it's not our problem, but it's an American problem. And so I want to start off there today because I think we have to grapple with the fact that America has never been a democracy. Because once you understand that America has never been a democracy, then you can understand how we got Christian nationalism. Because I think there's a fantasy, and the fantasy is that, oh my God, we're a democratic nation. Somehow we're going to walk out of this and it is going to be safe. Guess what, folks? You got about 40 days to figure this out, like Doug Mastriano says. And let me tell you, he's not fasting because he just thinks that's going to help him win. He's fasting because he wants all the Christians to come together and fast with him to see something different. And so I want to start off there because I think a lot of what we think about authoritarianism, we forget that people have beliefs. And we forget that those beliefs are not just walled in and siloed, but they spread across. They move in different circles. They just, you know, they germinate in different kinds of ways. And so what I want to bring out today is 3 or 4 points that I'm going to say up front, and then I'm going to back up and talk about them. One is what I would like to call this routinization of authoritarianism. That is the first one. The second one is about authoritarianism in history and education. The third is about authoritarianism and violence and religiously sanctioned violence, and the marriage between authoritarianism, authoritarians' leaders, and religious leaders. And so let me go back and start with the first one. So you heard me sort of say at the outset of this that, you know, this has always been there for some people. And I would like to submit that authoritarianism in this religious context has always been here. But what we are now grappling with is something very different about authoritarianism. And I want to use Pentecostalism as a way to talk about that because it's come up in several kinds of ways today. But I think you need to understand that evangelicalism really doesn't exist anymore. Evangelicals are Pentecostals. Now that may be shocking for those of you who are out here listening to this in the room and also on the webinar. But when you start to hear regular evangelical leaders who see themselves as arbiters of what is out there start to talk about demons, and demons are a big word. Start tracking the word demon. The word demon is being used by so many people. I'm gonna close by talking about somebody who used the word demon today. This Pentecostal ideology about believing God for these kinds of leaders, authoritarian leadership that comes not through, ordination or sanctioning, but comes through by the hand of God being on you and the hand of God moving through you. And so sometimes that can break gender molds. It can do all kinds of things. So for instance, if we want to think about the way in which this is really working right now, don't look at some church leader. You need to look at Sean Fogt, whose name I always mispronounce. But what did he do during the pandemic? He led singing things that broke all the COVID rules around because he didn't care. He was like, God called me to have worship services, and all of these people came around. So that's one way this is happening. What is Michael Flynn doing at these Reawakening America rallies besides being a preacher? Well, guess what, folks? There are people who are being baptized at these rallies, baptisms at political rallies. This piece of how these things are happening are coming together in ways that you cannot even keep up with because they're happening so quickly and they're blossoming in different kinds of ways. And each one of these organizations has its own kind of authoritarianism built in. The authoritarianism that they have that's built in is an authority that you cannot touch. Let me quote a scripture to you that some of us in this room know very well. 1 Chronicles 16:22. What does that say, folks? It says, touch not my anointed and do my prophets no harm. You can get away with anything by quoting 1 Chronicles 16:22 because you are a prophet. And so whether we talk about New Apostolic Reformation or any one of these people who are out here either burning books in Tennessee or saying other kinds of things, they are God's anointed right now. They are authoritarians just as much as a political leader is an authoritarianism. And they have followers and they have people who believe in their authority. See, we talk about authority like it's big A. Authoritarianism is small a. Because authoritarianism, while you think it is destroying democracy, it is democratizing people who don't believe in democracy. You got me? What I'm saying here is that this kind of religious authoritarianism has taken people in a space to another level. They can be their own authorities. How do they become their own authorities? They can shop online to find whatever they want. So if you come into, let's say, for instance, a vaccine denier, how did you get there? You might be somebody who's a new age person. Let's not make this just Christianity. But you got into this because you looked at a yoga person or somebody like that. And the next thing you know, you're following all kinds of people. And then you end up being in QAnon. Sidebar, I stayed at the hotel with the QAnon people in Dallas. They had lots of money, folks. They were able to pay rack rate. I was not paying rack rate. And I was like, dang, maybe I should be in QAnon, but I digress. What was interesting to me is that they were out every night after 11 o'clock doing their charts, looking at their numbers, trying to figure out when JFK and RFK are coming back. And this was scripture for them. They have a scripture. They have a way to think about these things. They have predictive ability. So what I'm saying to you is that this way of this routinization of authoritarianism, it's not just about authorities coming down on people from this religious place, it's rising up from the bottom. And when it rises up from the bottom, something else happens. And so whether it's grievance or something else like that, this routinization, that happens because people are embracing these ideas and passing them back and forth becomes something else altogether. Theology does not matter. I don't care what people say. Everybody is speaking in tongues now, whether it's the tongues of angels or the tongues of demons, they are speaking some kind of language. That's number one. And let me say this in a small way too. This crosses race. There were not just white people at QAnon. There were Black people there. All of this, we've talked about it like it's white Christian nationalism, which I think is a right appellation in some ways, but it is the embrace by other people of wanting that whiteness to rub off on them, to make them be in power and to have authority. And if we can't think about it like this, we cannot think about it in any way that is useful for where we are right now. That's number one. Number two, authoritarian requires that you need to revamp education and history and everything else. So disclaimer here, I wrote a chapter in the 1619 Project. It is the most, benign chapter about the history of Black church in America and democracy, right? Who could fight with this? It's a true story. But the 1619 Project, led up to the 1776 Project, right? It has been this thing that everybody has glommed onto. But I submit 1619 is just a thing about a bigger panic, which is, how is our history changing? What is happening because we're talking about history in different ways? If we can't talk about Western civilization anymore, what does it matter? And so all of these books that are coming out of the libraries and all of these spaces and everything, it's not just about, simply, we don't like these books. It's about, I don't know this history, and once you tell me what this history is, I don't like what I'm hearing. This is not the history that I heard from David Barton. This is not the history I hear from my pastor. Or history like when Glenn Beck used to talk about the Black Robe Regiment, right? That was back in 2010. Most of the people don't even remember that stuff. But now we have to discount history as a way to create a new kind of authority. And what's great about this when people do it is that they can become an authority on history themselves. And so we can't just talk about this as something top down. Again, education is bottom up. I got a lot of flack when I wrote a piece for MSNBC about homeschooling, a history about homeschooling that people knew. Oh, but Black people homeschool, but this, but that, she's wrong. And I'm like, I know all of that. But what I'm saying to you is that these kinds of educational projects that are, proliferating right now, and are not just in homeschooling, but in the case like Hillsdale and other places, are changing the way people think. And so when they get to a place like Yale or Penn, they'd be so lucky to get in, then we have to tell them that this history wasn't true. This history was a constructed history for you to feel better about yourself. And we haven't talked about affect here at all, but I need to tell you that white people's feelings are driving so much of this right now. Y'all feel a lot. And your feelings are making people freak out, and you're freaking out. So feelings aren't facts, but feelings drive a lot of what is going on. So let me say that. When does authoritarianism turn into violence? I think this is a really important question. I want to say this in the light of what happened at 1/6. 1/6 had some antecedents. One of the 1/6 antecedents was the Jericho March. If you don't know what a Jericho March is, if you know your Old Testament Hebrew Bible, Jericho March is you march around the city, the walls fall, right? Well, the Jericho March had lots of people there praying for what was going to happen on 1/6, that God would intervene. These were not authorities in the traditional sense. They were people like Paula White and others who were, a certain kind of religious authorities. I would just like to say publicly that one of the things I was so wrong about with Trump was that I used to call these people the D list. They are the A list now. They are the A list. And I called them the D list because I just was like, nobody knows about them. Why would we care? But now these names like Lance Wallnau and everybody else are the A-list names. And they are the ones that are leading the charge so that politicians are coming behind religious leaders. It's not politicians in front of religious leaders. They are behind religious leaders right now. And they are being led by religious leaders. In fact, I submit that you could really call the Republican Party a religious group because of the ways in which they operate and behave and what they're doing right now. And I know that would make people mad, but I think it's really a good point. And so the other part of this is that we have to think about things that we've called fringe as being part of this mainstream. So I'm thinking about a group right now in Pennsylvania that has moved into Tennessee, Rod of Iron Ministries, where they wear crowns and they worship the AK-47 and other guns, and they're like 20 minutes outside of Scranton. And this is led by one of the sons of the Moonies cult, right? Sorry to say cult, but Moonies, right? And then this is really interesting to me because you see a lot of politicians gravitating to people that they haven't gravitated to before. Most people don't even realize that one of Washington's newspapers is owned by the church. Most people don't realize that they have given money to lots of Republican leaders since the 70s. And so I think we have to think about these kinds of connections that look really strange, but they also are bringing in an element of, violence into the mainstream. Even if they haven't been violent before, we don't know where things are going to go because it is like a religiously sanctioned thing, which leads me to something that's not American, but I think we have to pay attention to. And this is how I'm going to preface by saying it's American. You have to think about how authoritarian leaders, whether they're political or not, have linked up with religious leaders. And in this particular case, I'm thinking about Vladimir Putin and his speech that he gave today. Now, in that speech, he said about America and the West, they have abandoned religion and embraced Satanism. Okay? Understand, this is the same rhetoric that's happening in America right now. This is going to resonate for some religious leaders here. A few months ago, I wrote back about how you could see people like, Franklin Graham and others being in Russia a lot. We have not begun to think about the ways in which all these religious leaders were going over there in the early 2010s and 2020 before all this happened. And now we're here. Actually, the biggest thing that Russia ever did was a disinformation campaign. They have won that tremendously. But if we start to think about these linkages between American religious leadership, political leaders, places like Russia, and Viktor Orban or Bolsonaro, who have election in 2 weeks, we cannot simply think about this as white Christian nationalism in America. This is a movement across the world for whiteness that has Christian overtones. It's not a crusade, but what it is a way of reframing arguments that are old arguments about civilization and who holds it and who has it and who can disseminate it to the rest of the peoples of the world. It's a way to take Christianity, in a sense, and make it turn out to be not so much an authoritarian religion, but a religion that says, you too can be part of the chosen ones. We don't have to have just Jews to be chosen anymore. You can be chosen. They're not the only people anymore, you are. And if you only get in with these people who are going to be the right kinds of people that you need to listen to, then you have a different kind of authoritarianism altogether. And so I'm going to stop there, but just to say this, and I want to say this in closing, I think it's very important when we start to talk about, congregations and who's at a Trump thing, a Trump rally and everything else, to realize that there are always people there. There are always people who are the signal mark. At the Trump rally, I always think about Blacks for Trump. They are the signal, right? And in a way, they are signaling something to other Black people. You should get on board or else you're going to get left. You will be destroyed in all of this. And so when I talked to Uber drivers and things like this, and this is how I knew things were changing, and right before the election in 2020, I talked to lots of Black men who said they were going to vote for Trump. And I was like, how can y'all vote for Trump? They're like, oh no, he knows what he's doing. He's got money, he's got this, he's got that. And I thought, oh, this is about power. It's not about the things he's saying. And if you don't have power, whiteness looks good to you. Because white people seem to have power in this particular world. And so if people who are running political campaigns right now paying attention to this, then you can understand why our demographics are changing, first of all, and secondarily, why some people are willing to embrace authoritarian leadership, because they don't want to be left out. It is a tactic for survival. Thank you.
Okay, so you all have any questions or responses to one another?
Oh, Anthea, I just wanted to say that was amazing. Two things. I had just a quick comment and a question. You said you used to call them the D list,
Mhm.
the Lance Wallnows and the
Yeah.
Paula Whites, and I don't know. I think that they still are the D list, and the great sort of discovery, and it sort of goes with what you're saying. Like, hey, you can make your own history. Trump's big discovery was, I don't need to get the big shots.
Right.
Nobody really knows who they are. I just need some people to be in a picture with me, laying hands on me. Anyone will do.
Yeah,
Lance Wallnow may now think he has replaced James Dobson, but
probably.
he can go and come and go. But I wonder that great phrase of yours, if you might say more about the promise of whiteness, which
Oh,
I feel
yeah.
like you're sort of gesturing toward at
Yeah,
the end, and,
yeah.
and how that works in
Yeah.
Christian nationalism.
You know, when I wrote The Promise of Whiteness, I feel like you elucidated more than I might have been thinking at the time, but then I realized what I was really trying to say, which was basically, you too can be white if you will just embrace all of these things, right? And that is going to give you purchase, that will give you power, that will give you esteem, that will give you all of these things, right? So when I wrote it, I was thinking about the context of Black evangelicals who had tried to be in the, an evangelical mix, and then evangelicals either sort of let them in but didn't let them in. But now I think about the promise of whiteness, as you've really pointed out, as a way to say everybody can be a part of this if you take it the way that we say culturally and socially you should be. If you embrace those things, then you too get ascribed with a certain kind of whiteness. So it's like all the people who maybe surround Trump or surround all these other groups, and I can think about this when thinking about Black conservatism. If you do these things, then you get to be us. You will be accepted. We don't have to look at race. We can just flatten race. Race doesn't matter. Race is just a construct. Now, they wouldn't say it like that, but it means that you can be in these places too. It doesn't matter. So, when I think about this, I think about, all the things that Clarence Thomas said he was going to get rid of, but he said he was not going to get rid of interracial marriage. Okay. So, I'm not going to get rid of my own wife, but, the rest of y'all got to figure this out.
Jeff, I wanted to touch on that. You mentioned the Black American flags, and I went down a bit of a TikTok rabbit hole when I was researching them, and there is a staggering number of TikTok videos of people solemnly taking in their regular American flag, folding it up like at a state funeral, and then to sort of piratey sounding, threatening music, putting up the No Quarter Given flag. And I think that kind of shows how these accelerationist elements kind of filter into sort of online spaces. Like, yes, they're coming out of online spaces, but they're being put back into them as well. And I was wondering if in the people that you've spoken to, if in the last month, have you noticed sort of an escalation of rhetoric? Because you said, the imagery, the fascist or authoritarian imagery, the skulls, the bones, that's all present. Has anything in the sort of emoting changed?
Just in the last month?
Oh no, in the last months, plural.
Oh, months. Okay, I was going to say. Why just yesterday? That's really interesting about the TikTok, and I like what you say there too. And that seems to me another kind of calm response, how something comes out of the internet into real life and then back into the internet. That's the pulpit pew. There's the congregation. But yeah, I think the acceleration. I mean, one of the things that I started last summer doing this, traveling around the country, and at a time, if we can remember it, when the idea of an American Civil War was so preposterous that to even mention it among serious people was that was in June last year, and by summer that year, like, well, maybe, yeah, there's just, when I say like there's more guns, I mean, I've been doing this kind of reporting for 20 years. I've never been escorted out of a church by gunmen before. And now I have. In fact, now I've been to bunches of churches that have their own militias. Maybe I was missing them before, but that does seem new, just like that flag seems new. I mean, taking down the American flag is a big step for people. And I think that shows a pivot and a renunciation.
I also, have a lot of questions about the use of flags and the kind of alternative flags that have proliferated. And, I think when I think about the covers of a lot of the books of people in this audience, they almost always have an American flag, right? We associate the sort of sacralization of the American flag and this kind of patriotic fervor around the flag with Christian nationalism, right? Flags at churches, flags at rallies. And so it strikes me as interesting that there would also be a proliferation of these alternative American flags, right? American flags in different colors, if only because the presence of those kinds of flags on the other side, right, would be framed as deeply sacrilegious, right? Or as an affront to the country's sacred heritage. And so, how does that get reconciled? Or are we seeing a kind of putting away of, the kind of sacredness of the American flag because we're in a moment of, right, where we have to suspend normal kinds of norms and resort to violence if necessary, or, call forth alternative sacreds if necessary?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And this endless proliferation of flags, which begins, of course, I think, with the right's frustration with the pride flag. Well, if you can do that, that's a desecration of flags, because flags are supposed to be red, white, like all flags are supposed to be red, white, and blue. There is this, and I have no way of measuring this except, just looking out my car window as I drive back and forth across country. There's way, way more American flags too. I don't think as much of that is on the right. I think a lot of it is actually coming from center right people, liberals, and sort of saying, which is how the center slouches rightward. I think the way you said that is just right, that it's time to put it aside. We are in a chaos moment, which has its own kind of order, like the taking down of the irregular American flag and the raising, that's a transfer authority. And to remember, as neo-Confederates love to tell you, the Confederate flag is not actually the Confederate flag exactly, it's the battle flag. So the all-Black American flag is a special time flag. It's a battle flag.
And I think another example that could maybe help explain this is when we look at January 6th, because I got a lot of questions where people were asking, but these are the self-proclaimed like MAGA patriots. Why would they desecrate the Capitol? They defecated in the Capitol. How does that go together? And I think this is where we go back to the Jericho marches, to the spiritual warfare. To them, it's not a desecration because the desecration has already happened. It's already corrupted, because not only people can be possessed by demons, by bad spirits, but also institutions. So to them, this was a reclaiming of what they felt was rightfully theirs. And so I feel like the thing with the taking down the American flag and putting up the black one is a similar thing. It's a signaling that what the American flag symbolizes to them. We've talked a lot about that they see that, the country's in decline, we're standing at the abyss, we're gazing into the abyss. This is about making sure that our America, the real America, continues to exist, because it doesn't anymore. And that's a declaration of war.
I mean, I think in the very sort of first days after January 6th, it was not uncommon to hear things like, you can't break into a house you own, referencing the idea that, the Capitol belongs to the American taxpayers. And not that all roads lead to taxes, but they do for me. But I think that it sort of exhibits this feeling of ownership, right, over certain spaces. And it's the illegitimate occupiers of power that have broken in, right? It's our country, it's our capital, and figuring out who gets counted among the our is complicated, right? Because there are ways of talking about this that says anyone's welcome to sort of be part of the us as long as they follow certain rules, right? Have certain values, right? Assimilate in certain kinds of ways. But nonetheless, there is a sense that some people own this house and some people are here illegitimately. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask a question myself first, and I'll turn the mic over to Jason. So it's incredibly generative discussion for me, and I just want to put a couple of kind of analytical ideas out there for consideration. So one thing that has really been emphasized here is the seemingly paradoxical relationship between order and disorder. And so one way of rendering that contradiction coherent, I suppose, would be to talk about regeneration through violence, which is a core aspect of many fascist movements. And then I think too, there is, this I'm having a little bit harder time formulating, but the problem of when I was young, which I'm not anymore, the smart kids would all talk about the crisis of meaning, and the absence of meaning. And this is the exact opposite of the situation that we find ourselves in now. We find ourselves in a situation of a surfeit and a surplus and an excess of meaning, which, on the one hand, sort of, authorizes this radical self-authorizing production meaning that you were talking about, Anthea, but also creates this credible sense of crisis in itself, just because, the surfeit of meaning is, in a sense, for some, also a kind of disorder. Those are, and then I do sort of have a question which I want to put out there, and this is really mainly for Jeff, I guess, this idea of the concretization of metaphor, and then also the sort of the sort of ritual marking of the transition from order to disorder. I think that the word ritual might be key. Also an understanding how we move from metaphor to action, right? So one way of sort of dismissing what's going on for a while, and I'll actually single out Ross Douthat here by name, since this has been like a recurring thing he said in many of his columns. This really raised my hackle. It's just cosplay, it's just LARPing. And I think that is so wrong. And I guess what I'm sort of suggesting is there might be an intermediate, if I can put it this way, liminal step between metaphor and action in this case, and that is this, ritual that we talk about as cosplay heroism, making yourself, enacting a kind of a mythological scene, dressing up as a hero, right?
Well, I'm grateful to both you and Annika for sort of drawing out that is a ritual space, which I don't think I'd quite identified, but to that idea of just cosplay, and that's not only coming from conservatives. I think we hear that also from the liberal and the left as well. Anytime I talk to people about the sort of militia folks I've been hanging out with, and there's always lots of body shaming involved. I bet he weighed 300 pounds and couldn't, and I'm like, well, if he has a gun, it really doesn't matter how much he weighs. And also, I think that guy had a lot of steroids and would pound the heck out of me. This insistence of minimizing, which I think actually sort of runs left to right, just cosplay. And I don't think there is anything as such as just cosplay. I told the story before, years ago. Peter Manso and I were reporting with a sheriff in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and he wanted to make a point about someone who had used a cap gun, not a real gun, but to threaten a church. And he pulled a gun out of his drawer. He was already, it was a fairly antagonistic moment. He pulled a gun out of his drawer and pointed at us. And, we just about jumped in our seats. And he says, He says, now, if you'd done that to me, I would have shot you. And that's just to show you the things that aren't real can still hurt you, which is, I think, something obvious that we need to contend with these cosplayers, because it will become real. And I think QAnon is a really great example of that, because we keep seeing these stories. With just one, I think last week, of a man who killed his family. Not the first, won't be the last. I don't know what the death toll of QAnon murders is. There's an even larger number of attempted murders, of just cosplaying into the real. So I'm not sure if I'm sort of getting at what you're saying, but like, there is a ritual aspect to that cosplaying that is a way of incarnating it, right? Summoning it into being. Just in the way that I think this actually goes to what you said, I thought so interesting, Anthea, about there's no more evangelicals, everyone's Pentecostal. I mean, I know, Episcopal churches where they're doing deliverance ministries and exorcising demons. That's the metaphors getting solid and into the world.
Yeah, I just saw yesterday, somebody on Twitter, can go look this up real quick. It was a group that was now appealing to the Knights Templar for some of this Christian nationalism stuff. And I'm like, these are old tropes. I mean, I'm gonna bring you back to the day that Anders Breivik killed everybody. And remember what we did online? We looked at all of those kind of statements, right? And you had said something really interesting after this. You said, you can look at all of these kinds of manifestos and see the same thing coming out over and over and over again. And this is the other piece that we haven't really even touched yet, but the manifestos that people are putting out that also have these kind of nationalistic things, but they're ritualized too, because they show a process in which how people get to that point that they're ready to go gun down a whole bunch of people.
Well, and what was the last one? The Buffalo Shooters Manifesto. Yeah. He described the process. Mm-hmm. I mean, he did a term paper on himself, just as Anders Breivik did with, but yeah, and that passing on, and it's sort of easy to dismiss each one of these individuals with their individual problems, right? But this is sort of the other thing that I find fascinating about this sort of embrace of this sort of schizo wave aesthetic, which is not to resist the idea of the individual, and I don't want to marginalize mental illness, but not to dismiss that, but to say, in fact, that is the actor. That is the one who acts, the brave man, just like Trump. Trump is kind of, Trump's crazy, but he tells the truth, which someone was sort of saying they love him because he lies.
It's a great panel. I just wanted to list a couple of comments to highlight that. So the point about Putin, and I don't want to praise, Tim Snyder doesn't deserve any more praise than he gets, but the point about Putin being white supremacist, like when I first met Tim years and years ago, I was like always talking about race. Race is a central organizing principle. He's like, oh, I'm an Eastern European historian, doesn't figure here. But then when he was writing Road to Freedom, he was like, Putin is the leader of the global white Christian nationalist conspiracy. And if you look at Road to Freedom, he discovered in the writing Road to Freedom that picture of Obama glaring at Putin was widely distributed in Russia, hugely taken as humiliating, and all of the so the what you nailed that whiteness, that Putin, it is this white. The second thing, that Jeff's point about innocence, you can link it to Tim's piece on the memory laws, where he says the memory laws are part of a global fascist movement to preserve innocence. Like the anti-CRT laws fit in with the Polish laws. In Russia, it's illegal to talk about the crimes of the Soviet Union during the Nazi time. They're all there to preserve innocence. And this is the global fascist attack on education. And finally, I just think we need to dwell on the reaction to the 1619 Project for a long time, because I talk to conservative after conservative, not just conservative, lots of my Yale colleagues, centrist liberals who are freaking out about the 1619 Project, but never read it. I was like, oh, I'll read it later. I just read the reviews. And the 1619 Project was in the initial, I think, Nicole Hannah-Jones has probably been radicalized by her experience, but the initial thing was very conservative. It was like as conservative as you can get. It was like, it starts with an American flag and how Black Americans are super patriotic and how Black Americans helped America realize democracy. And when I first read it, I said, this is elegant, straightforward, very conservative. And as a leftist, it's too American and too patriotic. And that people responded to Nicole Hannah-Jones like that, you know, and the project, and was completely not, like unhinged. And gender has a lot to do with it. If a Black man had written that, then people it would have been more legible maybe as a patriotic peon, like, look how central Black Americans are to the realization of democratic norms. Lots of us, when we first read it, were like, what democratic norms have been realized? It was like, it was wild. It was completely misrepresented. And again, the image, like Annika was saying about how they always put, it's part of like fascist propaganda to represent people in this. They were always putting images of Nicole Hannah-Jones showing her teeth, the gold teeth with, you know, so it was again and again. Well, we don't have to read it. We've seen the picture of Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's this thing in which you have to, you know, demonize somebody in order to get to the next thing. So you know what it is this week, right? It's Lizzo playing James Madison's flute, right? So it's not even the 1619 project anymore. I just want to say thank you, girl, for playing that flute, because basically now they've forgotten about that. And it's like all these people in their feelings because she put her mouth on a flute that the Smithsonian let her play. I mean, it's just ridiculous. This is the craziness of this kind of way in which these things get coded as this means that we're going away. And I'm just like, this is your fear. Your fears are driving you to insanity.
I have just a short follow-up question to that, because I think that when we talk about the 1619 project, public discourse about it tends to focus on this as really a debate about race.
Mhm.
And, you know, your comments really started pointing to the fact that this is also very much about religion, and that we can't actually fully understand it without taking both of those into account. And so I kind of wanted to tee you up to sort of tell us more about why we need to see it that way.
Yeah, you need to see it that way, in part because I think one of the things that is the big fallacy about, you know, America being this great country for religious freedom and everything else is that it's only religious freedom of a certain kind. And so what we haven't really wanted to say, and what we don't like to say about ourselves all the time, is that, you know, the state religion of Christianity actually did some bad things in America. And so I think this is one of the ways in which this, I like to call it the naivete of religious, you know, freedom and all of that. It's a thing. I mean, people forget that Catholics and Protestants fought in the streets of Philadelphia, that, you know, we have demonized all kinds of religious groups in terms of, we used to have a term called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Nobody says that anymore. You know what replaced that term? Evangelicals. Because that is the term that got coded as white. Now, I don't know what we say. We say MAGA, we say whatever, right? But I think it's really interesting that the parts that we don't want to look at ourselves, whether I'm talking about, you know, those of us who do journalism, those of us who do history and all this other stuff, is not to take the role of religion seriously in the American context about race. And if you don't take that seriously, you don't understand the KKK, you don't understand how Mormons could be at first just as bad as Black people, but then now they really, you know, are on this other side of whiteness, right? And that's why Mormons took on whiteness, because they knew they were outsiders. And then they came in when, you know, they gave up polygamy. And then it was like, how white can we be so that we can be like them? So we can be American. So I think this is what this kind of thing we have to really wrestle with and understand that for all of these groups that come in, it's always a wrestling with this kind of undercurrent of state religion that defines what is going on in America right now or in the past.
So Brad Onishi, University of San Francisco. So question for Annika and then question for Anthea. Annika, you talked about the idea of contagion. And then you talked about, you and Jeff were discussing, you know, J6, really all of you were discussing J6 and the Capitol riot and defecating in the halls violence in the nation's axis mundi, et cetera. Is there a way that was national antibiotics? Antibiotics destroy things in your body when they've gone wrong. And so if this is a national body that's undergone an infection and needs to have some sort of antidote, then send that antibiotics in, destroy everything, and you'll feel better somehow. My question for Anthea is, Anthea, you said that the GOP is now a religious group, organization, et cetera. That made me think immediately of Jerry Falwell's I Love America rallies. Do you see a continuation there, or do we have a kind of qualitative difference? He did altar calls for America at those things. There was a choir. It was very patriotic. So was that the beginning of the process in terms of the religionization of the GOP as we see it today, or we kind of at a new point? So.
I think that's a very interesting way to put it into the idea of a body that's been contaminated by a virus or by an illness. I would say that I would say that's a plausible image, because when we look at the rhetoric, not just right before January 6th, but decades before, there is this sense that secularization has spread and has contaminated what they claim used to be a pure America, a white America, a God-fearing America. And in a way, I would say, and this goes back to what Phil said about the sort of the belief that violence can be a purifier. That is inherent to authoritarianism and to fascism. And I think that would be one way to interpret what happened on January 6th, that these people thought, we have to escalate, we have to take this back. And there's no going back, there's only going forward, there's only escalating this further. And that's why all of the predictions of all of the alleged red lines that existed, that were just like ran over. That's why there is no going back in this cycle. And so I think that's a very helpful image.
I think you have a good point about Falwell. I'm also thinking about maybe it's earlier, because what came into my mind first was Nixon. And this is very funny. I think about Nixon, but you'll realize it in a minute. I thought about Nixon as, when he's running against JFK, obviously Catholicism is not the religion we want to have. We want to have somebody who is a Protestant. And yeah, so what if he's a Quaker? So they're quiet. We don't even care anymore. This is the moment. And then I think about, what did Billy Graham do? What did Billy Graham do? He took everybody to Lausanne and said, we cannot let this man win. And then he left Norman Vincent Peale on the hook for trying to come away to push back against JFK. So I think it starts much earlier, but the point that you bring up is an important one. It doesn't work for Republicans unless you have these rallies. And so there's been this, if somebody wanted to do a really interesting, sort of dissertation, you could look at all of these sort of religio-political rallies that have happened. I think a lot about Glenn Beck's Awaken America, or, I'm thinking about the one that happened in 1970s with Billy Graham. Everybody, yeah, exactly. All of these rallies reinforce all of this, right? And they serve a purpose into putting this out in the ether, so that the regular person knows that, the party and religion, or all of these things are together, right? And so now Trump rallies became that, right? I think Trump is the person who really blew the door open on this marriage and solidified it and put a ring on it, as Beyonce would say, right? He put a ring on it. And so now they're having a hard time. I don't know how they divorce. I don't know that they can get a divorce right now. This is going to be a marriage that is going to last for a long time, whether they like it or not.
So as thinking about some of the things that were said, all I keep thinking about the whole time, especially with the idea of whiteness, is white supremacy is a hell of a drug, and thinking about the folks the Black folks showing up for QAnon, which is highly racist and anti-Semitic and all these things. But the idea is, hey, I get to be white, and I get closer to being white. I get closer to whiteness. But I think one thing I was thinking about was, and as other people mentioned, like the growth of Pentecostalism. Like, look, they're no longer evangelicals; they're now Pentecostals. So you said everybody's speaking in tongues, everybody is seeing demons and casting them out. I mean, I've seen that in Episcopal churches, is like laying hands, and we've seen the growth of Pentecostalism throughout the global rise of it. But within the U.S., I guess the problem is, if you think of the history of Pentecostalism, that it grew through C.H. Mason, partly through him. And the fact that you have people taking this religion and using it for a very twisted racist ideology, but failing to recognize the role of a Black person and ordaining many of the Pentecostal ministers that started this off. And furthermore, C.H. Mason's use of Pentecostals to push back against racism. It's, I guess in a way, I don't want Pentecostals to be left on the hook for everything that's gone wrong, because they're blamed for prosperity gospel, for this. But it seems like there are certain elements of Pentecostalism early on that clearly that would revile against this. I mean, Mason didn't want people to join the military.
Yeah. And
now they are saying dying for your nation is the best thing. Killing the enemy is godly.
Yeah. So can I'm gonna sum it up like this, all right? There was a history, and there's a history that Pentecostals like to tell about themselves, but then they wanted to be evangelicals too. And then they took over the evangelicals, and then it became something really messed up. Now, I think the other thing we could talk about, that's another conference, is to talk about circulation of ideas and how these things move back and forth. And one of the things that I think is very interesting to me is that we can talk about how these televangelists went across the world and did stuff. And then all of this came back here in different sorts of ways, because of the places in which Pentecostalism went, whether that was Nigeria or Uganda or all these other places, they took certain things with them. So I'm thinking about your work, with the anti-LGBT stuff, right? These things got transported back. There are things about Pentecostalism that sink right into the conservative realm, and you can pull them through, and you can say anything you want to say about it was interracial, it was great and all this, but there's some other bad stuff too. And that's the problem, is that this whole history that we thought we were going to write one way got twisted, and now it's something else, and we have to reckon with that. Have to, because I'm sorry, I'm gonna say this out loud for everybody on Twitter. Kojic been on the wrong side of stuff too. What happened with them with Ferguson? Right there in St. Louis, and didn't do a doggone thing.
Add something onto that, I think what's interesting to me is the way that white supremacist Pentecostal churches now invoke actually that history to justify their authority. And I'm thinking of Rod Parsley in Ohio, a smaller church. I mentioned a church that sort of escorted me out with gunmen. It's a Lord of Hosts in Omaha, Nebraska, with a kind of minor national following. Both these guys, as you encounter oftentimes, white pastors building their authority on what they claim is their anointing from a Black Pentecostal tradition, and saying, both those guys will say that they have both said, I'm more Black than fill in the blank, whatever it is, right? So in a way, it's sort of like they're taking that history, or I think of like anti-LGBTQ stuff, Lou Engle, and I think out of Kansas, right? Is he in Kansas? Going to Uganda and invoking the progressive history of Pentecostalism to build these alliances around a new enemy, which is queer folks, right? So, it's just even more insidious to me to see that they're not erasing it, they're taking it and repurposing it. I think we may have talked before in the past about, I don't know, I think it was around 2008, 2009. I was writing a lot about Christian nationalism in the military, and not making the connection, still thinking of it in service of the state, but not making a connection of what it has become, but it's insurrections because it gives authority, most famously with General Jerry Boykin of Black Hawk Down fame, to whom it gave actually John Wayne authority, right? Because that's the model. That's you may have to break some rules to keep the rules in place. And I think of like Officers Christian Fellowship going back to, I think, 1950s or 1940s, which has been slowly building up this idea. We were talking about dual loyalties in a different context, but they've been saying for a long time, you have a dual loyalty to the chain of command and to this chain of command. And when those don't reconcile, you are not mutinying by breaking it. So I think that to me is actually the scariest thing going on right now. It's not malicious, it's that within the military.
I'll also add, I mean, I think that there's been a tension on the right for a long time between, right, what we would think of as nationalism, patriotism, which involves pride in the military, support for law enforcement, and also a strain of anti-government extremism, right? And those have always kind of existed in tension with one another, and they can be reconciled at different times in different ways. So there are people that would say, right, I only support law enforcement up to the level of the county, right? And once it goes sort of beyond that level, that is too high, right? That's an authority that is too high and can become tyranny. And so, right, there's that, but there's also then a bit of, as I talked about, picking and choosing which law enforcement agencies are good and which are problematic. And so I mentioned that there's been a long time effort to delegitimize the IRS and to argue that this is, you know, a problematic institution that's threatening the freedom of Americans. But this comes out of a longer history of rising kind of anti-government sentiment within the Republican Party in particular, that starts with these kind of big two moments in the early 90s, the 1992 Ruby Ridge sort of standoff that resulted in the death of the wife and son of a white supremacist, and then the 1993 Waco raid that results in the death of a number of people in that compound. And so in the wake of that, there was a lot of concern about government overreach. And so the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, actually cites what the US government did at Waco and Ruby Ridge as his justification for attacking a federal office building in Oklahoma City. These events are basically credited with igniting the modern militia movement, right? People who believe that they need to join into local groups that are armed in order to protect themselves against a kind of out of control federal government. And after Oklahoma City, a lot of people step away from that rhetoric, right? And there's a lot more scrutiny on those militias, but within weeks, months of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Republican Party actually launched a series of investigations into sort of whether the FBI and the ATF, the two agencies that were really involved with those two events, right, whether they had acted inappropriately. And so Arlen Specter, I have the quote here just in case it came up, but Arlen Specter led the charge and sort of called for these inquiries. And he gave a quote. He said, "We sit on a powder keg with a lot of anxiety and anger welling up across this country as to excessive action by the federal government. They staged hearings that sounded a lot like those hearings in 1997 and 98, talking about the government's use of military style tactics against ordinary American citizens." And so, right, at a time when a lot of people were trying to sort of really tamp down that rhetoric, the Republican Party leaned into it and legitimized it in many ways. And so I think we can see how this has always been, it's been for at least a couple decades, a strand and within the party, and something that we have to grapple with.
Can I just say something real quick? There's a the Boogaloo Boys, everyone knows the Boogaloo Boys. They have a flag, which is the American flag, covered with the names of martyrs, including Ashley Babbitt and Vicki Weaver from Ruby Ridge, but also Mike Brown. They put them all in together as, you know, the victims of this government. But yeah, Vicki Weaver just looms so large still.
And I think it really comes back to the principle that Phil and Sam point out in their book. It's freedom for us and it's order for them. And it's also linked to these conspiracist ideas. So if the military has been taken over by the deep state, then I do not have to follow orders anymore because the institution itself has become corrupted. So the Patriotic Act is in fact to, the Patriotic Act becomes mutiny. And when they raid our guys' home, that's bad. One law for us and another law for them. And at the same time, they're already promising to use the power of the state to enforce their own laws, plans to fire non-political appointees. I think that was a couple of months ago when plans from the last days of the Trump administration got circulated, and to, you know, replace them with real Americans, with real patriots.
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm going to take us back a little bit in time to think about when I was going out and running after Sarah Palin. And one of the things that I came up with then was I was thinking about people who called themselves NASCAR Christians. And we were just talking a little bit about this before it started. The people who weren't affiliated with anything, but considered themselves a Christian, they would stand up at NASCAR rallies for the flag, you know, all of that stuff, and all willing to pray, all this stuff, and just considered themselves to be Christians, but didn't go to church and didn't do anything else. And so I think those are the people I think about that have the grievances, right? That this is the intersection of the nationalism and everything else, because they might not necessarily be affiliated with something, but they do see themselves as being Christians, right? Now we could probably think about it like, you know, some of the disaffected people who might have been at 1-6, or the people who were cheering on people at 1-6, or, you know, people at MAGA rallies, right? That go to the rally because that's their church. You know, that's the thing that brings them together. They don't, you know, they don't hear what they need to hear in a regular space, but these are the kinds of spaces in which they hear what they need to. And so that sort of kind of like, I'm a Christian fervor with alongside of a kind of a nationalism, but the kind of nationalism that Trump is selling, which is basically like everything is awful and it's in decline, right? You know, if you go back to think about his inauguration speech of, you know, how it was so much about, you know, this is carnage and all of this other kind of stuff. I mean, it's unlike any speech anybody would have ever given. But it resonated with people because it touched on something that they couldn't really think about themselves. And they knew it was in the ether, but he got that emotion out of them. And so I think about all those people as being the ones who are right now going, yeah, I don't see myself as being a part of all of these things, but I feel those sentiments. I feel like this, and I feel like God is being taken out of our country. I don't want God to leave our country. I need things to remain like they are.
I have met a lot of January 6ers, all of whom invoke Christ, none of whom are churchgoers, which is just interesting to me, and I think that's worth noting in the comparative sense too, that, that's, as I understand it, Putin's Christian nationalism too. It's not like Russians are actually going to church that much, but boy, do they like the idea of it.
I just wanted to sort of share, I'm Sarah McCammon, I'm with NPR. I cover a variety of things, including a lot of the intersection of religion and politics. And I guess one sort of unusual thing about me is I have done that for about 7 years, which came after about 10 years of professionally trying to find as much distance as possible from the fact that I grew up essentially in this world. And I wanted to cover things that had nothing to do with it for a whole lot of reasons, but kind of almost accidentally fell into covering a lot of these issues. So I bring kind of a unique insight, and I think maybe one of the few people at this conference who actually grew up in the white evangelical world. And from that perspective, with that hat on, I just wanted to address a couple of the questions about the boundaries between these different types of movements. And in my own experience in the Midwest, growing up in the 80s and 90s, those boundaries were extremely malleable, and there was a lot of cross-pollination. I mean, the church I went to was charismatic, sort of independent Pentecostal. The school I went to didn't believe in any of that stuff, Christian school. The college I went to was an evangelical free college, which had its whole other set of theology, but we were all, in retrospect, unified by, I think, a common theology, underlying theology, and a common sort of vision of where we were coming from and who we were and where we were headed. And so I think that also explains some of the malleability of these categories and the permeability to some of these ideas, because it's I always say it's a subculture as much as it is a religion. But that aside, the question I have is actually for Anthea about, I was very interested in what you said about this idea that this sort of authority in these movements is increasingly sort of self-appointed and less dependent on traditional ordination practices. And that's something I observed growing up, but I have no doubt it's more and more true 20 years later. And I guess the question I have is how, if you have any insight into how different groups or different leaders adjudicate who is an authority. And what I'm partly getting at is I see, there's always been an effort on the religious left, quote unquote, to the extent there is one, to sort of push back against some of these right-wing projects. And often they appeal to the same kind of authority. We too are Christians. We too share these values, but they mean something different to us. So I guess the question is, who decides, especially when the traditional authority structures are less and less important?
That's a really good question. I want to just say briefly that I think the way it goes is I'm thinking about Mastriano right now, and he has his own self-styled prophet. I'm going to forget her name right now. Somebody probably remembers it. Julie Great, thank you. Who's just been wrong about everything, I think, basically. I don't know if she's gotten anything right, but she's a prophet, right? And who made her that? Did she have a few meetings or whatever? It's this very interesting thing about how certain people rise to the top. I think it's about what you have, what sociologists talk about charisma, right? Do you have that right kind of charisma? Are you connected to certain kinds of groups? Do you, this thing that we talked about with these network churches, I think they're networked people. And they're network people who end up, drafting alongside another person and get their, authority that way. So that's one. But the other thing is that I think, we have to really contend with is that, I could just change my name tomorrow on Twitter and become like a prophetess if I wanted to. I mean, I could just say, I could be Juanita Bottom and charge $1,500 for a prayer meeting, right? And like everybody knows in the Black church tradition that Juanita Bottom has no anointing whatsoever, but she is getting people to pay $1,500. So if you have the right kind of cred, you can do these kinds of things. Or I think about somebody like Apollo White, who has moved through these different kinds of groups and then became, Trump's, person, right? So it's interesting to see this, but I think there's one thing that I did not bring up that I should just say now, is that it's also about this way about American individuality. The individual can always be this person. And somehow, I don't know how to put this together with it, but I think it's about this quest that we have about everybody can be their own person, to be the individual, to do all this, that gets alongside this kind of way of being an authority, that kind of brings these two things together and makes this kind of almost an invincible way of being, even if you're wrong all the time. You know, it doesn't matter if you're right. It just matters if you're loud and out there. And we see how loud and out there work with Trump.
Can I just add, I mean, the way you're talking about that almost makes me wonder if it's similar to, you know, the ways that you become an influencer.
Yes.
You become an influencer if you can attract
Yeah.
an audience that wants to be influenced by you, and sort of the best people rise to the top, right? And that has also come to fruition in a world where social media allows you to reach audiences, but it has also disrupted, right?
Yeah.
Standard forms of marketing. You no longer have to go through those
Yeah.
things, right? I mean, there might be specifics that are different to the religious sphere, but it seems they're structurally kind of similar.
Yeah, no, they are. And I'm just thinking about this, like, you know, I keep bringing back Mormons, but Mormon influencers have been really important
Very.
to all of this.
Yes.
You know, the way in which that this is about whiteness too. It's a great book by Cully McDaniel who talks about Mormon women. You know, the way in which they even structure their homes with all this white and all this stuff. And I thought about this when I know you're all going, she just thinks about popular culture too much. Kim Kardashian, when you saw her house and it was all this like really pristine thing or whatever, there's a message just being sent through all of this. And we don't pay attention a lot to the messaging that comes through with what you see about these groups. And so there's even a way of saying, we talk about flags, but it's not just flags, it's clothes. It's all of this stuff. You can tell what people are signaling to you at these events by what they're wearing and what they're doing and what they surround themselves with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think of your work on fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Hi, Brian Haggard, student at Cornell University. Quick question, recognizing time. I just thought it was really interesting, the conversation around kind of cosplay and whiteness. And I was just thinking in my head of the white privilege of cosplay, that, you know, the most stringent gun laws in America was passed when Black Americans started arming themselves. But, you know, the critique of the January 6th was how close and how far things got, and how powerful whiteness is allowing white supremacy to basically play around and pretend up until it's too late, and then it's too late. So just kind of talking more about the intersection of those two. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things I said on Twitter that day was like, man, if there'd been Black people, they'd never made 2 steps. It's the truth. I mean, this is part of the whole thing. And so this is how the white guy can walk into the Walmart with the gun, but the Black guy that walks into the Walmart with the gun is immediately, you know, either taken down or shot. I'm thinking about that Walmart case where he just picked up a gun to look at in Walmart and got shot and killed.
Not
right?
even a real gun.
Yeah, not even a real gun, right? So there's these ways in which whiteness plays this kind of a role in also protection. Right? And protection and cover for people who are doing things that might not be legal or whatever. But if you can invoke that in a moment like 1/6, then you don't get paid attention to, right? You don't have to worry about the same kind of scrutiny until it's too late. It's also why, and this is, you know, something to bring up since we kind of went around this, when you stop looking at white supremacist groups and all of this, you know, for a while, government wasn't tracking everybody. And now you got a huge problem, because you can't keep up anymore, you know? And so how do you adjudicate this now? So I have to say to you that, I mean, this is gonna come up next month when people are going to the polls. You know, who's gonna be standing out in front of some polling booths somewhere, you know, or out in the parking lot with a gun, you know, and they're not guarding the polling place. They're there to intimidate people. Will they be escorted away? Will they be able to just stand there in certain states because, oh, it's just a white guy with a gun, he can open carry? See what I'm saying? So, yeah.
Yeah, I just, it's not cosplay when someone's there
real.
with a gun. And as a person who has had a reasonable number, but not an very unreasonable number of guns pointed at them, and never been shot, I'm not saying that was just cosplay. It's always a threat. And they know it's always a threat, but with January 6th and that protection, I think of Ashley Babbitt, the insurrectionist who was shot, and the immediate emphasis on the shooter, who was a Black man. And it took 2 seconds for that to proliferate vastly, and then to sort of go into the shadow army kind of thing, right? That he was there as part of this secret force, and that we white folks were just having fun invading the Capitol, but the Black shadow army, any Black man with a gun, even if he's actually an agent of the state, is somehow an enemy, and so on. And I think that sort of moving of the rules of cosplay is maybe important.
Okay.